Yeah. All right. So let's dive in. Our focus today is going to be on the scene analysis, and we talked about that last time we gathered. And hopefully we'll be able to go through Genesis 22 together, just as an example and an exercise, and just to sort of bring us up to speed where we're at. We're in the fourth step of the process, where the focus is on the narrative and doing our particular specific steps related to breaking down a story and understanding the story. And the key elements or the four aspects of narrative analysis or looking at a story, examining the story, is one, understanding the setting of the story. That is the background. Of course, the two, understanding the scenes and how the story is broken up. So we're going to focus on today. And then the characters, and then all that leading to understanding the plot. So those are the four parts or aspects or categories of that we consider when examining and studying a story. All right. And so we started with understanding the setting analysis, and you can just think of that basically the background of the story, the when and the where, and then also in a sense the who. That is the background, the culture of the characters that are involved in the story. So we want to understand where the story happened, when it happened, and also who is involved in the story. That's part of the setting analysis. And then we move from that to going a little bit more detailed and looking at this, what we call the scene analysis. And again, remember, scenes, right, are the basic building blocks of the story that the author uses, and each scene together will develop the flow of the story, the sequence of events in the story, and through those things, the plot of the story. That is the arc of the story that leads us to its main point. All right, and you can think of scenes like paragraphs in an epistle, but paragraph is a unit of thought that we find in an epistle. And each unit of thought is connected together to present the context of the author's flow of thought. Scenes are a similar function in that way. They each represent a particular part of a story that the author uses to develop his main point over the course of the story. All right, and so that's really how scenes are defined. Again, they represent units of thought within the story. Most stories, but not all of them, have more than one scene, depending on the length of the story. Now, how do we identify a scene? Well, that is a change in setting. All right, as the time or the location or perhaps even the characters change, that could indicate a new scene, a change in the scene. And so that's what we want to look for as we examine and study a story. We look for, okay, what are each of the scenes within the story? And that takes us to, again, the goal of scene analysis is trying to determine the point of each scene. That is, why is this particular scene in the story? I think last week, I believe we talked about John 4, and the scene with Jesus and his conversation with the disciples. And then even asking, okay, what is this scene doing here? And how would the story be different if we took that scene out? What would change? And so by doing that, we realized, wow, that scene was an important scene to contribute to the point of the story, because in that scene, Jesus revealed, or Jesus tells the disciples, he's been sent on a mission, and so have they. And so we see what John is trying to do in that story because of that particular scene and how it fits with the scene before and the scene after it. So that's, as we look at the scenes, that's what we are trying to understand and determine, is what does that scene accomplish in the story? What is the point of that scene? how does it contribute to the author's flow of thought? All right, and that then took us to sort of the procedure for scene analysis. So this is now, how do we approach looking at each scene in the story? Well, the first thing we need to do is identify each scene in the story. That is, look for, is there a change in time or a change in place or potentially a change in characters? Those all would indicate a shift or a change in scene. So those are the things we want to look for. Once we've done that, once we've identified each scene, and this is what we're going to do together, is then there's a specific, we want to examine the details within that scene. There's a few things that we want to look for as we examine that scene. So in this step, there's certain things we want to consider and identify in that scene. So from each scene, these are the kinds of things we're going to look at, and then we're going to do this in our example from Genesis 22. So the first thing we want to identify, first we identify every scene in the story, then we go back and examine each scene, and within that scene, we want to note these particular things. The setting, again, we've really already done that, but what has changed from the previous scene? Is it the next day? Is it another location? Is it another group of characters? So we want to first identify what has changed from the previous scene. Then we want to identify the key characters in the scene. Who are the key characters in that particular scene? And sometimes key characters may change from scene to scene. Usually the main character will be in most of the scenes, but sometimes even the main character may not be in each scene. So we just want to identify who are the key characters in this particular scene, and identify them. And then we want to identify the narrator comments. Now I want to take a minute and talk about the narrator. First, let me just throw out the question to you guys. Who is the narrator? We're talking about a story, and I say narrator. Who is that in the story? Anybody? What is it?
Is it the biblical writer?
Okay, yeah. In the case of the stories of Scripture, yeah, the narrator is the author. But when we're talking in terms of like a story and we bring up the narrator, what does he do? What is his role or function within a story? And I'm not looking for deep, profound things. Just basically, when we mention a narrator, who is that guy? He is the author of the story, but yeah, you Chai, how would you describe him?
Now, in the case of Genesis 22, the narrator will be Moses.
Okay, yes. And what does the narrator do within a story? How does he, because an author of a story could write a whole story and it just be dialogue, no comments from the narrator. But when he does make specific comments in the story, how does he, what's his role within the story? I guess be the question.
Would he be the prime mover?
Okay, the prime mover. And how does he do that? What does he do in the story that moves it?
Well, he's telling the story. He's
yeah.
monitoring the story.
He's telling the story basically, right? And he will insert comments in the story, such as the setting, but also he may comment on a particular character's thoughts or motives, or he may describe some other activity going on that is important to the flow of the story. But the narrator, and you're going to hear this from me over and over again, guys. So, I like to repeat things, but the narrator is a critical part of the story because he gives us insight and he gives comments and statements that are important in understanding what he's doing in the story. All right. So often we might ignore the narrator, focus on the characters and what they say, but often the narrator will give us clues and he'll make statements that we need to pay attention to because he inserts himself in the story to give us some insight or some particular understanding. He does that on purpose, and we need to pay attention when he does. All right. And so in the scene analysis, that's where we want to identify, okay, the narrator mentioned this particular thing or that thing. All right. So sometimes he'll just give information that helps to help us understand the scene a little better. But many times he'll give particular statements that are important for us to know to understand the point of the story. Let me give you one example of this from John chapter 9.
Yep.
John 9, if you'll remember, this is the story of the blind man, right? That Jesus meets just outside the temple. The man is born blind from birth. He heals him. And then the Pharisees find out, you know, it was on a Sabbath that he did this. And so they're, of course, upset. And they interrogate the man and his parents. And well, but in this story, there's some interesting comments. Notice here, maybe if I could get Fue, could you read for us? Yeah, just go ahead and read verses 1 through 7, if you would, please.
Okay. John 9, chapter 8. Yeah, John 9, chapter 9, 1 to 7. Okay, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciple asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he will be born blind? Jesus answered, it was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. He must work the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he has said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes and said to him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam. So he went away and washed and came back seeing.
Okay, there's one statement there you skipped over. Go wash in the pool of Siloam. And then what did he say after that?
Sent.
Yeah, which is translated sent. So he went away and washed and came back seeing. Okay, so where are the narrator comments here? Anybody? We look at verse 1.
7.
Pardon?
Oh, so the narrator or comment, verse 7.
Yeah. Yeah, verse 7, right?
Yes.
Okay, what does the narrator say there?
So the pool's name Siloam means or translated as sand.
Yes. So he makes some comments about, you know, there's some comments he makes to move the story along, as was mentioned. First in verse 1 that he saw a man, Jesus saw a man who's born blind. And so then there's some dialogue with Jesus and the disciples. Then verse 6, the narrator describes what Jesus does. right? He spits on the ground, makes the clay, puts it on his eyes, which we need to, we're asking now, why did he do that? Couldn't he just have healed him directly? Why does he put this, make this mud to put it on his eyes and then tell him to go wash in the pool of Siloam? Well, then notice the narrator then gives us the meaning of the word Siloam. Because again, remember, John's audience is a broad audience, and so he's anticipating Gentiles maybe reading this. And so at times he makes these comments, right, about a particular word, what it means. And here he gives it the meaning of the word Siloam, which is translated sent. Now, that may not seem like much, but as we go through the story, there's an emphasis on this idea of who Jesus is, right? The Pharisees are angry with him. And what is it that Jesus tells them as we go through? And we'd have to go through the whole story, but Jesus, where is it? At one point, he talks about that he came into this world, that he was sent into this world toward the end as he is speaking to the Pharisees. But I think a lot of people get confused, or they don't really consider what is this comment that the narrator makes. Why does he say that? Why does that matter? And I think as you study this story, you realize there's an emphasis on the fact that Jesus is sent by God. And that's actually a theme in the Gospel of John, but it comes out here in the story because the Pharisees are attacking, what gives Jesus the right to heal on the Sabbath. And Jesus's response is that he is sent from God. And I think that John is trying to draw out this focus on Christ being sent by, telling us Jesus sent the blind man to a place to wash, and that the name of that place was Sent. And he's using that to reinforce, I think, a major theme in this story and one in the whole gospel, which is that Jesus is the sent one. And so what seems to be a minor comment, actually, we need to pay attention to, because in that comment, I believe John, the author, who is serving as the narrator here, gives us an insight because he's trying to point us to what the message that he's trying to communicate in this story. So again, he could have left this out, but he doesn't. He adds this thought. So anytime anytime we see the narrator provide comments, sometimes he's giving us information, like at the beginning, as he passed by, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. All right. And so he's just directing our attention to what's happening in the story. And then in verse 6, he describes how Jesus goes about to heal this man. But we have to recognize that he doesn't waste his comments. I guess I could put it that way. That the narrators are inserting and give important information to help us not miss what he's trying to communicate in the story. Does that make sense? I think if we were to go through the whole story of John 9, I think you'd really see this is just a quick summary, but just that little statement is an important insight into what John wants us to see from that particular story, and really what the issue was, right? The Pharisees were rejecting Christ, and what did Christ continually tell them? Look, the Father sent me. I am here on a purpose, and so I think John's drawing that out. Chai, did you have a comment or a question? Sorry,
I have a question. Thanks, Pastor Tim, for helping us to see the narrator's comment, because often we read the scripture, we just kind of didn't pick it up. So my question is this, is John 2:11, yeah, is John 2:11 an example of the narrator's comment? And likewise, John 2:22.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a great example here, because, you know, as we studied, I think we talked about this story at some point, right, before, you know, what's this story doing here? You know, the wedding at Cana, how does it fit? And we really wouldn't know unless we had the narrator give us this summary statement in verse 11. Right? He says, so this is the beginning of the signs Jesus did in Cana. And so that's the narrator really in this place telling us the point of the story, I believe. That this is the first of Jesus's signs, his miracles that point, that tell us, you know, reveal to us who he is. So yes, 2:11. 2:12 is a narrator comment, right? He's now moving the story to the next scene, to the next story, actually, right?
Yeah. And then I was asking 2:22, 2:22, correct? And another example of the narrator's comment?
Yeah. Now here the narrator actually provides a lot of comments, right? These last 5 verses are all from the narrator. Some of his comments, he's carrying the story along. Some of them, he gives us further insight into what the point of the story is. And so here in verse 22, yeah, he inserts this comment that that is how would I put it? He's giving us some insight.
Now, I was thinking, Pastor Tim, this verse 22 is a bit like the Back to the Future kind of comment that John took us to post-resurrection, when the narrative is before the resurrection.
Yes, yeah, exactly. He's obviously writing this story, right, much later, 60 years later. And so, yeah, he gives a comment of something that happened, you know, after the gospel, at the events of the gospel. But he felt that at this point in time, it was important to point this out, to bring this up. And so if we're summarizing this story, we want to take note of that. Verse 22, the narrator indicates, you know, what the disciples remembered after Jesus rose from the dead. Why does he insert that here?
Yeah.
Right? You want to ask yourself this question. And so in the scene analysis, what we're doing is just uncovering the narrator comments. All right. Now, some of them are just, you know, carrying the story. The narrator mentions the next scene, or the narrator describes, you know, what this person does, or he describes something about the background. But then there are those comments the narrator gives, like verse 22 there, or verse 11, that he's wanting us to know this because it helps to understand the point he's trying to give us in the story. The narrator is the all-knowing one in the story, right? I think Dwayne mentioned something like that earlier. He's the guy that moves the story along, but he's also the guy that knows. He's also the guy that knows. He controls really where the story goes. Okay, so he'll make comments as he sees fit to draw our attention to some particular aspect of the story, or some particular understanding that we need to have to know what the point of the story is. But he only drops clues. The narrator doesn't often say, okay, let me tell you the point of this story. It doesn't work that way usually. Usually he's doing that by revealing these insights as the story moves along.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
I was just thinking, is that just about a couple of, maybe 2 Sundays ago, 3 Sundays, I was just listening to a sermon by a very good preacher from Melbourne, Australia. and he was dealing with the issues of should Christian drink alcohol at all. And then he was referring to John chapter 2, Jesus at the wedding at Cana, and there was just plenty of alcohol, right? And he was saying that if we are not careful, someone could take that story that John narrated about the wedding in Cana and say, hey, Jesus provided alcohol, and that's why we all can drink to our heart's content. But by noticing the narrator's comment in verse 11 and 12, 11 in particular, really the story is talking about Jesus revealing his glory. It's not about whether you can drink alcohol. So I think, Pastor Tim, what you have said is very important, that by noticing the narrator's comment, it helped us to hold the hermeneutics to what the author meant the story to tell us, and not to sideline and say, here's how you can drink alcohol.
Exactly. Exactly. Great example. Yeah, that even takes us to the, remember the descriptive versus prescriptive. Just because it happens in the story doesn't mean that's what we're supposed to do. And yeah, that's further understood or emphasized by recognizing the narrator comments, as he will guide and direct us to what he wants us to understand or to see from the story. And so yeah, John, that story in John 2 has nothing to do with whether or not we should drink alcohol. Certainly, if it was wrong, Jesus wouldn't have made the wine. So, you know, in that we could say Jesus would never have done something that was sinful, you know, but we can't draw out principles from that story on alcohol, because that's not the point of the story. We have to go to a prescribed text like Ephesians chapter 5, which says, do not get drunk with wine. Doesn't say don't drink it, but don't get drunk from it. So, but yeah, the narrator is key, brother. So actually in several of the steps in the story analysis, we'll be looking at the narrator. In scene analysis, we simply just want to identify what are some of the things that the narrator brings up in the scene. Then in the next step, we examine more closely how the narrator comments contribute to understanding the point of the story. But I think the narrator is often overlooked, or he's kind of just seen as the guy who, you know, just gives a few comments about where the story happens, but often we will get very important insights from the narrator, who is, of course, in the biblical accounts, the author of the story. All right. So that's something, as we do the scene analysis, that is what we want to consider, right? The setting of the scene, which is, by the way, given to us by the narrator, the key characters in the scene, and then the narrator comments. And then we want to also focus on what are some key statements made in the dialogue. Again, the dialogue is the interaction, what the characters say. And so we want to draw out, as we look at and examine what the characters say, are there any statements they make that seem important to the point of the story? All right. So that's the fourth thing. Then what we want to do is come up with a one-sentence summary of the scene, just describing the scene, write in your own words the key event or the focus of the scene. And then it's also helpful, I just put down a sixth thing, is that sometimes as you're going through the scene, something may stick out to you that you hadn't noticed before, or may seem important to the scene. And I just said, you know, note those things, write them down. Sometimes just things come to your mind as you go through a scene that you want to take note of. So those are the 6 particular features of the scene that we want to give attention to in the scene analysis. Setting, the key characters, important narrator comments, and the the important dialogue, summarize the scene, and then finally, if there's any observations or comments that come to your mind as you go through the scene. All right, those 6 particular items. All right. So what I'd like to do, any questions on that before we go to the next, before we move forward in this? Any questions? Okay, so let's do this. Let us do a scene analysis on Genesis 22 and the time we have left together. And what I'd like to do is first we'll have us read the story. Again, I've asked you to do that on your own, but I'd like to just have us read through it one more time. As we do, try to identify the scenes in the story as best you can, and then I'll give you some time to go through and identify those 6 key elements that I, excuse me, just talked to you about. And see it look at, sorry, you look at each scene. I've still got that cough. You'll look at each scene and identify these 6 elements in that scene that I just talked about, all right? So before we do all that, let's go ahead and read the story together. I'm going to ask, we'll start with you, Chai, if you could read 1 through 5, and then Brother Dwayne, 6 through 10, Daniel, 11 through 15, and Pastor Philip, if you could do verses 16 to 19, all right?
Okay. Can you scroll back to this one, brother?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can you see it?
Yep. Genesis 22, verse 1. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you.
Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there, and arranged the wood, and bound his son Isaac, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son.
Brother Daniel, did I ask you to read the next section here? I can't remember.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Verse 11.
From 11 to 15, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
excuse me. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it will be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, I think that somebody else should read that, right?
Yeah, Pastor Philip, read that part.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem.
16 to 19.
15.
Yeah. And said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham lived at Beersheba.
All right, great. Thank you. All right, so first thing we want to do is try to identify each scene within this particular story. All right, and to do that, we just are looking for change in setting. Okay, so as we go back and look at this particular story, can't really make it too small or we won't be able to see everything here. Okay, obviously we start the story here in verse 1. Okay.
Yep.
So that's the first, starting the first scene here. Okay, now where do we get a change in time or place? Where's the next?
From the end of chapter 21, Abraham was living in Beersheba for a long time.
Yeah, we could go over here. Let me do this. All right. Can you guys see my whole screen here?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, the end of chapter 21. We learn Abraham is in Beersheba. All right, so that gives us the place, right? So scene 1, begins in verse 1, of course, but we know that Abraham, what I like to do is just put where. So he's in the land of the Philistines, Beersheba. And we know that from, as you just pointed out. And then when, just says after these things, right? Verse 1, so after living there a few years following Isaac's birth. Okay, we don't know exactly, but it's roughly, because Isaac is now a boy. Okay?
Yep.
Now, how far does this scene go? When is there a change in time or place? So that's the opening here. God speaks to Abraham. Anybody identify that? Where does the next scene?
Sorry.
Where does the next scene begin?
So verse 3, Abraham rose early in the morning.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. So This tells us what has changed.
Time
and place.
Yes, the time. So there again, I like to just write down. Okay,
When
where? Okay, now he's journeying to Mount Moriah, right? So he gets up and
Yes.
leaves. And when is the next early morning.
Next early morning. Yes.
The next day. Okay, good. Let me just highlight. Okay, so scene 1's very short scene. It's just verses 1 and 2, right? Where God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son in Mount Moriah. Then verse 3 begins the next scene where Abraham gets up early and begins to go. Now, where is there a change in setting from this point?
So
Verse
how about
4.
Pastor, verse 4?
Yes.
On the third day.
On the third day. So here,
Time and
notice.
place.
Yeah, so let's do scene. So the third scene begins in verse 4. Okay, and where does it take place?
Is it the place where God appointed them or appointed Abraham? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
He's approaching Mount Moriah, right?
Moriah. Yes.
Okay. And when it says
On the third day.
on the third day from when?
So from verse 3. Is it verse 3?
Yeah.
Yeah, from when I believe it's from when God gave the command.
Yes.
Okay. Because the first day would be verse 3, and then the third day would be so that verse 3 would be the first day. So that from when God told him sacrifice his son. So here we have verse 4 begins the next scene, which we're calling scene 3 here. And how far does that go? When is there a change in setting?
Is it end of verse 8? Yeah, I did a little bit. Yeah, verse 8, I think.
Okay. Verse 8. Why? What has changed here? Or I guess, sorry, not. Is it verse 8 or through verse 8? I didn't.
Yeah, end of verse 8.
Oh, end of verse 8. I'm sorry. Okay. So verse 9. What has changed here in the setting?
Oh, sorry. So verse 9 also the same place.
Well, it says now they came to the place. So they weren't there yet until verse 9.
Oh yes. Yeah.
So they're actually at Mount Moriah in verse. Yeah. And it's still on the third day, right?
Yeah.
We would say, later on the third day. See, I believe you're correct. I think this is the next scene here.
So can we say that the verse 4, is it verse 4? Yeah, they were sort of at the foot of Mount Moriah.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, it says they saw the place from a distance. So they're not there yet, but they could see the mountain, but they still seem to be far away. And so it's interesting, right? As you look at this story, there's no interaction between Abraham that's recorded between Abraham and his son, right? As they're journeying, they get up the next morning in scene 2, they travel. Then there's nothing mentioned about the rest of that day, right? It just says they got up and went, right? Got the young man, donkey and they left. And nothing is said about the rest of that day. Nothing is said about the second day. Only on the third day, we're given a few statements that are made between Abraham and Isaac, right? And we'll talk about this when we examine the scenes.
Okay.
But just this short dialogue on day 3, and that's it. And then they find themselves at Mount Moriah in the next scene, scene 4. Okay, which, how long does this scene take place, scene 4, where they're at Mount Moriah? Is there a change in setting after that? Anybody?
Is it end of verse 14?
Okay.
9 through 14? Yeah.
Well, is there a change in location or a change in time at verse 14?
Oh, they are at Moriah.
Yes.
On the top of maybe Mount Moriah.
Exactly, which is where they were in verse 9, right? At Mount Moriah.
Yes.
And he makes the altar, puts Isaac on it. So verse 14 is just after this all happened, right? They're still at Mount Moriah, and he had just offered the ram, and then Abraham called, and then the angel spoke out. So we're still at the same place, basically, at the same time.
Yes.
You see that? So it's still the same scene. All the way until really verse 19, which is just the narrator comment that transitions to the next, this is the conclusion of the story. So Abraham went back, right? So that we might call, I wouldn't call this a scene as much as just a conclusion here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So really in this story, we have 4 scenes. And really, they're pretty short. The major scene is scene 4, right? When they're actually at Mount Moriah.
Yep.
These other scenes are pretty short, but they are distinct, a distinct difference in setting. Okay? The first one is just sort of the introduction to the story. Abraham is in Beersheba. It's sometime after chapter 21, a few years later, and God gives Abraham this instruction. And then that's it. Curtain comes down, because verse 3 is the next scene where Abraham gets up early and saddles a donkey, and they leave. And that's it. Scene 3, starts in verse 4, and it's just while on the journey, as they approach the mountain, this very short dialogue between Abraham and his son. And then the curtain closes there, because the next scene is they're now at Mount Moriah, at the location where Abraham is going to offer his son. And then there's the events that took place there and the dialogue between Abraham and the angel of the Lord. Okay? So that's it. Then there's this concluding statement right at the end there of the story. All right. Any questions about that? Does it make sense how we identify each of these scenes?
I think it is very helpful by just the way you have done it, Pastor Tim, is that with the text of Genesis 22, and then you're just putting scene 1, 2, 3, 4, and the fact that scene 4 contained most verses, it became very immediately visible. That is where the emphasis of the narrative is probably located.
Yeah, most of the attention in this story is definitely here in scene 4.
Yep.
But again, what's interesting is, if you were to take out any of these scenes, you know, take out scene 3, how does that change the story? How would that have changed the story? Or the same for these other ones. Obviously, scene 1 is setting up the story and the problem that Abraham faces now. Scene 2 just seems to be a simple description of, you know, the preparation and leaving. Scene 3 now, the author inserts this short dialogue. And how does that, and again, we just we need to be just thinking right now, how might this contribute to the story? Okay. And then, of course, yes, I agree with you. The major part of the story now is actually when they arrive, what's going to happen here, right? What's going to take place? Is Abraham going to kill Isaac? You know, what is God going to do anything about this? And, you know, all of that takes place here in this particular 4th scene. Okay. But yes, it is a significant part of the story. But again, we can't ignore the other scenes because they do contribute in some way to understanding the point of this story. Otherwise, the author wouldn't have included them. For example, we get nothing, as I said before, there's nothing here about what happened on the 2nd day. Nothing. Now, did things happen on the 2nd day?
Maybe.
Well, of course they did, right? They at least were journeying and probably ate meals and probably stopped to rest. And, you know, they may have had some dialogue. We have the 2 young men there. Maybe they said something, or we have the donkey. Maybe that was Balaam's donkey. You know, he could have said something. Obviously a joke there, but certainly things happened on the 2nd day, right?
Yeah.
But the author skipped all of that.
Yeah.
Why?
What would be natural? Sorry, what would be natural to imagine? But obviously Moses didn't think, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, important to record. What most probably happened, as we can imagine, Abraham talked to his wife.
Maybe.
We
don't know.
I mean, yeah, but obviously it's not important to the narrative.
That's the point. That's the point, You're exactly right. Yes, many other things happen that we just don't know about. Because why? The author did not think those were important for the point of his story. Again, we don't know. You know, that's one of the biggest mysteries to me is, did Sarah know? And if she did, how did that conversation go? Right? I mean, that would, to me, would have been most interesting. But we aren't even told if she knew.
I mean, she would have said to Abraham, "Are you out of your mind?
Yeah, I mean, we
got a hearing problem. You better see an audiologist."
Yeah, that's right. You know, God told you that, right? You know, now they could have talked about it. We just don't know.
Yeah, but based on the previous dialogue that Abraham had with his wife, telling her, "You do this, you do that," probably she could have said, "But okay, you go ahead and do what you want to do. You know, God told you to do this, you go ahead and do it," and she won't argue, because when they were accosted by by Pharaoh's people, she just tell them that you are my sister. You know, so she did that obediently. So probably this would also be a situation where God has asked me to take Isaac to such a place, and you know, no,
maybe
no arguments, no arguments.
But this is now
submissive wife.
Yeah, this is now the child, though. You know, whenever children are involved, the mothers change into something else. So I don't think Abraham, you know, could have gotten away with it. But we don't know. That's the point.
Well, I think that if we know the culture of the day, the women were kept in a separate tent with the kids, and the men and the women really didn't have much interchange, except maybe at night, or I don't know when, but there was a lot of tents around, and the men were definitely segregated from the women. I'm not sure Sarah would have been her business to know what was going on. And I would suppose Abraham probably would have kept it from her because it was a little sensitive. She would have went, she'd have got very emotional, made a lot of noise, and he wanted to avoid that, no doubt.
Yeah, that's a good point. That could be why he rose early in the morning to get in the tent to sneak Isaac out before anybody's awake. But again, this is the point. There's a lot of interesting possibilities, and certainly that to me would have really built the drama of the story, right? What did Sarah think? Did she even know? Did he? But the author said nothing about that because that had nothing to do with his point. Right? That's why he didn't bring it up. If there was something with Sarah that was important to the point of the story, then I'm certain he would have brought that up, but we're left without knowing. And the second day, right, as they're traveling, we don't know what was said. We don't know what happened. We don't know anything. We know they were traveling because they got to Mount Moriah, but did they encounter robbers? Did Isaac and Abraham have a conversation, talk about what was happening? Certainly we see it a little bit in scene 3, but on the third day, but we are given no information about the second day and very little information about the first day they left. Why? Well, because that was not important for the author as he's telling the story. Okay? And this is, again, when you think about the Gospels, and right, even John says, so many events happened in Jesus' life, more than all the books in the world could contain, right? You remember that statement at the end of John 20? So when we look at the Gospels, there are only certain events, certain statements that the authors include. They don't include everything Jesus said and did. Right?
Yep.
That would be a big book if you were to write about every event in Jesus's life, at least the last 3 years. That would have been a huge book, right? But we're only given some parts. And even in his sermons or in the dialogue, we're only given certain parts. We know that if you compare the Gospels and compare the same story in each Gospel, you'll see some differences, right? One author may include a statement or an event in the story that another author chose not to include. Now, that's not a contradiction. It's just what one author, he's making a particular point from that story, and so he wants to include the dialogue and the events that contribute to understanding that point. Whereas another author, he may have a different purpose for telling us the story. And so he will only include the things that were said and done that communicate his point. All right. So as you're examining and studying a story, notice not only what is included, but also consider what is not included. And by that, I don't mean make stuff up like, don't preach in your sermon what, Sarah thought about this, because we don't know. But we should take note of that Abraham doesn't say anything about Sarah. Moses doesn't say anything about Sarah. So that means that wasn't important to what Moses was trying to communicate in the story. All right. Certainly what, Sarah's involvement is an important thing as far as the family is concerned, but not as far as what this point of the story is concerned. Okay. So you want to keep that in mind as you study these narratives, that there are things that are left out because they're not significant for the author and what he's trying to communicate or tell us in the story. Okay. Just as well as the events that are included. So for example, as we look at this account, and we'll have to go through next week, we'll go through the details of these particular scenes, but notice he does include scene 3, which has this extremely short dialogue between Abraham and Isaac. And so we want to, as we're going through that scene, ask ourselves, okay, what is going on here? And why does the author decide to include, he skips everything from day 2. He only mentions this brief statement from day 1. But on day 3, as they approach the mountain, the author includes this short dialogue between Abraham and Isaac. And again, even this dialogue may have been longer. We don't know. He only puts down, okay, Isaac says, my father. Abraham says, here I am. Isaac says, behold the fire and the wood, but where's the burnt offering? Abraham says, God will provide. And then that's it. Okay. Also Abraham's statement to the young men is given as well in this account. But of all that happened on the 3rd day, it's just this short conversation that Moses tells us about. And again, we should be at, well, why does he do that? How is that contributing to this story? All right. And we're not going to answer that right now, but these are the kind of questions you want to be asking yourself as you're studying the narrative. These are the kind, and this is the point of the scene analysis, is to try to draw out these kinds of questions in our mind to be thinking about. Okay. All right. So what I'd like to do is this. Before we press on or move forward, are there any questions or comments or thoughts from that discussion?
Yeah, I think it really points up the amount of narrative that's involved and the little bit of dialogue you've got. We like to watch the life of Christ out of Good News to Modern Man, which came on the market when I was in the 60s. I was still a Lutheran then, and I thought it was great because it was so simple. Well, most of the new translations aren't much better than that, and I get them confused because I was really into the Good News to Modern Man because I thought that was so neat. Well, it still takes 3 hours to tell the life of Christ using the Good News to Modern Man. And if you take any of the, the New American Standard, it would probably take about 5 hours to get through it because there's a lot more narrative there. But, if you're setting up a drama, you got to have a huge amount of narration. And boy, the skill of the person doing the narrative is very important. And so it depends on how you want to cut your scenes up. But boy, if you want to cut the narrative out, we have about 6 scenes here, and then a few little dramatic parts that could really be done nicely and would be very, very, I suppose, meaningful. But it's interesting to take it apart and look at it and I guess see how you would block it and then present it as there's so much here, and what do you include and what you don't include. But yeah, we have to stick with the narrative and then the scenes, and so got to have a plan, and you've got to have, I suppose it defined as how you're going to work the plan, and it's good. It gives it really puts the things in perspective. I like this.
Yeah, thanks, Dwayne. I kind of look at the scene analysis like the block diagram, for the epistles, where we really examine closely each phrase and clause and try to understand how they connect to each other and what phrase is modifying which word. And, you remember all that from when we studied epistles. And it really, by doing that, it forced us to ask questions about, you know, how all of the words and phrases fit together. And the scene analysis, that's really one of the goals is to force us to ask questions. Like Dwayne just said, you know, how would you block this out? I mean, what would this look like if we were filming this story? And what is included and what is not? And what are some of the details that the narrator gives us, or the key statements that are made in the story? Because again, remember, not everything that was said on their entire trip was recorded in the story. Okay, just like you're studying a gospel account, not everything that was said was recorded. Not everything that was done was recorded. Much of the stuff is left out. I mean, Dwayne, you said, you know, the Good News Bible, that's like 3 hours. Well, certainly, you know, 3 hours doesn't cover everything that Jesus said and did in 3 years, right? We're just given portions or segments of Jesus's life from the author. Okay, so, well, hello. My grandson just showed up. Can you say hello to everybody?
Hello.
Say hi.
Hello. That's nice.
What are you
That
doing?
must be very early for him.
Yeah, well, it's 8 o'clock now, so he likes to come in for to watch bus songs with me. Songs about buses. So we'll do that in a few minutes, okay? Oh, careful. Can you say bye-bye? We'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, buddy. Come back in a few minutes, okay? Then we'll watch songs, okay? All right. Sorry about that.
No, not at all.
So this is kind of the scene analysis. The intent of it is to help us think more carefully about the story. And I think it's just one of the steps that helps us better understand and uncover what the authors wants us to see. And that's what's most important. So why don't we do this? Let's just go through the first scene briefly so you can get an idea of what to be looking for when we do the scene analysis. And then next time we gather, we can go through the rest of the story together. But let me go to, so we identified this first scene here as verses 1 and 2. It's really introducing the story, okay? And so again, we just want to take note of the setting. So what is the setting again of this first scene?
It's in Beersheba.
Okay, in Beersheba, which is in the land of the Philistines.
Yep.
Okay, that's the location. And then when does this story take place?
After quite some time, after Abraham had settled there for quite some time. We don't.
Yeah,
exactly
Abraham.
know how long. Yeah.
Probably a few years, because Isaac
is a lad. Yeah.
All right, and he was born in chapter 21. So they've been here a few years. All right, that's just what you want to know in the setting. We already just determined that when we were looking for the scenes, but I like to put it here as well. Okay, now who are the key characters in this scene?
God, Abraham.
And Abraham. And that's it, right? Again, Sarah's not mentioned here, right? There's nobody else in the scene, all right? Just God and Abraham. Now, are there any important comments from the narrator? So what I like to do here is just sort of break out. Okay, I'll highlight the narrator in blue. That's just where and then the rest of this, I'll highlight the dialogue in yellow is what God said. And I'll put Abraham's comments in green. Okay, so the blue is the narrator comments. Now, anything from the narrator that seems significant?
Well, the way God described Isaac to Abraham, or the way God referred to Isaac as take your son, your only son, whom you love.
Okay, now that's the dialogue. Okay, that's not the narrator there. That's actually what God said. So we'll include that here in the dialogue. So that's an important statement, but we're just going to focus on the narrator comments first. Anything from the narrator in blue that
testing is taking place.
Yes, God tested Abraham. That's a significant statement, isn't it? It's telling us really the purpose of God's motive here, right?
Yep.
That's a big one. Yeah, I mean, you could comment and say the narrator also gives us the setting here after these things. But I think this God tested Abraham is a pretty significant statement indicating insight. Now, the rest of it is just, he said, those are just carrying the story along, but aren't what we would call significant comments. Okay. Now, key dialogue. Okay, Yuchai. Now we're looking at what are some key statements that are made. And you were saying what again?
The way God described Isaac as your son, your only son whom you love.
Yeah, God's description of Isaac.
Yep.
Emphasis on how would we put that?
Well, the love that Abraham had and how precious he was to Abraham.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Emphasis on how precious Isaac. Yeah, that's a good way to say it.
Only son, yeah, wow.
Okay, good.
No, I was reading a narrative or a commentary today, and they said they thought he was about 20. I wonder if there's any way to determine that. He wasn't such a little guy. He was fairly much grown up, at least in his late teens, or might even been 20 perhaps. I don't know if there's any way to determine that.
Yeah, it's hard to say. He's referred to as a lad in the story, and that word can refer to someone in their 20s, but also it can refer to someone, who's 10 or 11. So the word lad indicates he's younger, but he could have been of adult age or a teenager or young boy. It's hard to determine.
This land, the Philistines, that's along the coast. And Beersheba is in the desert. That's way away from the coast. So it's just kind of hard to tell where Abraham was, if he was on, where it would be more moisture on the coast and on the flatlands, the rolling hills that come up into the mountains. Beersheba is really up in the mountains and in the desert. That's fairly close to Hebron. So it's kind of unclear where Abraham was too, but he was there.
Yeah, and we know he was a 3 days journey away from, what is known as Jerusalem. It wasn't known at that time, but right, Mount Moriah, we know later was the Temple Mount. So we know he's a 3 days journey from Jerusalem, which, could have been somewhere around, 50 miles or something like that. So we have a general idea in that sense as well. Any other statements in the dialogue that would be considered significant?
Well, the next one was go to the land of Moriah. Third one was offer him there as a burnt offering. I mean, God gave very clear instructions for Abraham to sacrifice Isaac.
Yeah, clearly offer Isaac as a burnt offering is a significant statement here, right? On many levels. And we're going to talk about that a little later as to why, what was the significance of this command in relation to the story, but also in relation to the bigger narrative of Genesis and even the Pentateuch. We're going to come back to this. But yeah, these would be all key statements by God. Now, Abraham doesn't say much, does he? Here I am. That's it.
Yep.
Okay. Mostly God here giving the instruction to Abraham. Now, how might we summarize this scene? In other words, how would you summarize this in a sentence? What took place here?
Well, it's the opening scene, and it sets the stage, and everything now is tied into this. And now they're just going to act it out.
Yes, everything's connected to this. The rest of the story flows out of this. How would you summarize this scene though? Like if you had a script and you were to title each scene in a sentence, how would you title this scene?
Well, you're going to have some very, very, what do you say, emotional music here, because
well,
this
yeah.
is emotional. Yeah, if you're going to have
Certainly.
music, it's not the dinner music here. This is a tragedy. We're looking at, I suppose something very frightening.
Anybody want to offer a way you might summarize this scene in a sentence? How about something like this? God tests Abraham, telling him to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac.
Yep.
Right? Something like that.
Yep.
The trick with summarizing something is trying to capture the main idea without repeating everything that was said, right? So obviously, everything's important here in the scene, but trying to capture sort of the main thrust or focus of the scene is what we're doing here. So this is just sort of how I would summarize it myself. And then observations is just anything that strikes your attention. I think the repetition here that Yu Chai pointed out, when God said, your son, right, your only son, son whom you love, that sort of sticks out here. There's an emphasis on that aspect that he's, and remember, by the way, Isaac's not his only son that he has, but he is the only one living with him. And there is a sense of Isaac is the son of promise, so he is the significant son as well. But also whom you love, that there's that tenderness and emotion there that's conveyed in that statement. Okay. So this is just, sorry, somebody had a comment?
No, so I was just saying, in this phrase, your son, your only son whom you love, of course, we have the benefit of the gospel, where at the, I think it was at the baptism of Jesus, there was this voice from heaven, the son whom I love, listen to him. So of course, that is kind of fast forwarding, just to kind of keep it at the back of the mind as we make observations.
Yeah, so that might be something you could put here. This reminds me of Jesus's baptism and what the Father said, right? So yeah, any thoughts like that come to your mind, they may be significant or they may not, but the point is just I think it's helpful to write down things that pop in your head, because that may come back later as something very significant or important, or it may not. But at the time, that's something that comes to you. So I think that would be an observation.
Well, the covenants are really big in here. And at the end, the Lord, the angel of Yahweh, actually takes an oath to establish that covenant that he had with Abraham of a seed, a nation, this great blessing to the whole earth. The covenants, definitely the timeless and unconditional covenants of God are now really brought to the forefront in this Isaac, because he's the seed of promise. And wow, now what's going on? It raises a lot of questions, and it ends up with God giving an oath. Here is that oath that Hebrews talks about. It. God sealed it with an oath.
Yes. Yeah, that's Dwayne. I think that's, often when I hear this story told or preached, there's a huge emphasis on the emotional component to it, with Abraham and Isaac. But that's a big problem in the story, right? God tells Abraham to kill his son. There's a bigger problem in this story. And it's related to exactly what you pointed out there, Dwayne. We're going to talk about this later as we think about how this story fits within the overall plot of the Pentateuch. But the bigger issue here isn't Abraham killing his son. As big as that is, there's a even bigger problem in this story as it relates to God's covenants. So we'll leave that there. But yeah, that's a really, really important insight that Dwayne is drawing out. And it just reminds us too that when we study narratives, we have to keep in mind, how does this story, so this Genesis 22 sort of, has its own focus. There's some elements there, but it's also part of the bigger story, right? So you can never isolate it from what's happened before and after, and even the broader point of the book as a whole, as we've talked about before. And so these are things to keep in mind. But in the scene analysis, we're just sort of giving focus and attention on particular details in each scene. So what I'd like to do next time we gather is we'll go through the rest of this story together, just looking at the scene analysis, and then introduce the character analysis and proceed forward on examining the story. And then we'll move towards sort of now what seems to be the point of this story. But at this stage, we're simply looking at details, things that seem important, and breaking the story down into its smaller parts. Just like we do with block diagramming, we break down a paragraph into its smaller parts and examine and study that. We're doing that here, but this is a narrative. So the things we look for are a little different than we would for when we studied an epistle. Okay?
Can I ask an observation question?
Yeah, certainly. Go ahead.
Which is in verse 1. I actually jot down as I was reading through Genesis 22 again. The observation question is, why did God need to test Abraham? What is the purpose of this whole thing? Because, of course, at the back of our mind, God is omniscient. He would know already. So what is the purpose of this testing of Abraham?
Yeah.
In other words, is it really God need to know, or the testing is more for the benefit of Abraham?
Yes, that's a great question. And even, why is Moses telling us this story?
Yeah.
Right, because we have to consider his audience. And so, yeah, those are the broad questions that, before we preach the story, we need to be able to answer those things. And so each of the steps that we're doing in analyzing this story is meant to help us get to that point where it's like, yeah, why did God do this in the first place? Certainly, as you said, God knows everything. So God wasn't trying to figure this out. Okay, now where does Abraham really stand with me? Does he really trust me? I think I need to do something to test that. Well,
Yeah.
then we'd have a problem theologically with that, because then that would be saying God doesn't know everything. And some guys interpret that from this story. There's a whole movement on open theism, it's called.
Yep.
Which is very, very dangerous. So doctrine. So that's something too. We have to understand, okay, how does this story fit? And there's some bigger questions need to be answered.
Now we've got to remember it's an inspired story by the Holy Spirit. Every word is true and meaningful. We got no liberty with it. What you said there about the purpose is what we have to isolate, because there's no a drama here. This is going somewhere, and it's super important not only to Abraham but to us. And so we've got to give it some really careful thought.
That's another question, Pastor Tim, is that the word sacrifice and burnt offering appears there. Abraham was asked to do something like that. I'm just wondering, does Abraham know what it's all about? Because the burnt offering was only mentioned in Leviticus chapter 6 to the children of Israel. So would Abraham have a full comprehension of, now you asked me to do this, and when you ask me as a burnt offering, now what is it all about, you know? So that's something maybe we had to think about it. What was it to him anyway? Was it a pagan style of offering, or he knew something about it already?
Yeah, that's a good.
Well, the idea of worship comes up quite often, and so to Abraham there would have had to be worship, and so you see the angel of Yahweh, and that calls for worship, and this was of course sacrifice was always worship. Yeah. Anyway, it makes us think.
Yeah, Abraham even mentions that, right? We're going to go worship here. So he connected it in that way as well, as a form of worship. But yeah, those are important questions that we have to, understand in the context of the story, because we have to be careful we don't import from later periods of time what that would mean. Because later on, like you said, in Leviticus, talks about burnt offerings. But is that how Abraham would have understood it at that time? Where no, there was no Mosaic covenant. At that point. So great questions.
I actually thought about that question as well, about burnt offerings. Would Abraham know what to do? And I actually look up a bit. Noah actually offering burnt offerings to God as he came out from the ark. That is in the Genesis 8:20. So in other words, there was some idea of burnt offerings. It may not be in the form or in the steps in Leviticus, but they have some idea.
Yeah, I mean, right? Cain and Abel offerings were made at that time by them. And then obviously Noah, as you mentioned, burnt offering. So we see evidence of it. So you'd have to study that and look back at what are all the examples of offerings prior to this point in time with Abraham. And that would help give some insight as well. So excellent. And that'd be part of what you would want to be studying as you're looking at the background of the story, right? The cultural background, sacrifice, offering, burnt offering would be a key thing to understand for this particular story. So, all right, good.
May I say something about the one observation that I noticed that it happened twice. Here I am. Yeah, when God said, when God tasked him, and the immediate reply is, "Here I am," and it happened twice. Is that because something about the not only the obedience, the question of obedience and faith, but also about the sending out, the command to send him out?
yeah, that's a good observation. So you want to take note of that, because that may prove significant as you further study the story. That, yeah, again, the author only included certain statements from Abraham. Of all the things that Abraham had said over that whole story, only those comments by him were included. So they're obviously significant in some way. You know, he includes "here I am" twice, on purpose. So I think that's something to keep in mind, how that would fit. So good observation. Okay, so next week, as I think I mentioned, I'm going to be training the guys in Pakistan at this time, so we won't be able to have our regular class. I'm asking if Joshua can maybe lead a discipleship lab time, just a time of prayer and interaction next week for you guys. So we'll let you know on WhatsApp, give you the details for that, and then we'll come back together, Lord willing, on the 20th. September 20th, and we'll continue on our looking at Genesis 22 and keep moving forward. Okay, so next week, Lord willing, we'll have discipleship lab, and then the following week we'll pick up again where we left off here. All right. Okay, Pastor Philip, would you close us in prayer?
Sure. Shall
Thank
we pray? Heavenly Father, thank you so much for our time and study together your word and how to dig your word as the author has intended. May you help each and every one of us to see your intended meaning, and also bless our teacher, leader, Pastor Tim, and also bless him and his teaching ministry. Especially we come together and pray for him next week. He is training our brothers who are in Pakistan. They may be equipped and edified as we are tonight. I pray all these things in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, brothers, and keep praying for my visa application to Myanmar, that would be approved. So we'll see if the Lord will do that as well. All right. Well, you guys have a blessed week. It's great to see you. Thank you for all the input and comments, and that was really I really enjoyed our discussion. I hope you did as well.
Thank you.
God bless. God bless.
All right. Have a good night.
Yes.
Thank you guys.
Good day to you.
Good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.